Let's get peppy. This is episode number 82, and I am in the airport hangar, which is the ABC foyer. I'm literally sitting on the floor because once again, I tried the podcast in the dungeon, and like last week or the week before, the lights are out. They're going to fix them eventually. Anyway, I've actually doing this a bit backwards because I actually recorded an interview with Nick Bryant, which journalist Nick Bryant, I'm going to insert at the end of this podcast. But now we're staying at the beginning of the podcast with Dr. Jennifer Hunt. Hello, doctor.
Hello. It's good to be back.
And you are a real doctor. You're not a fake doctor like Dr. Molina. You are actually a Dr. Dave style doctor, because we don't have to pretend, right?
Yes, I'm a doctorate, but not the gut stuffing kind, not a physician. So
fair enough. And what's your specialty?
So I'm a lecturer in national security at Macquarie University and a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Study Center. And I specialize in U.S. politics as well as energy and cyber.
Fantastic. We'll ask you about none of those things. No, we'll see. Even the stuff you don't specialize in, you know more about than me, undoubtedly. This would be a bit unusual for me. I'm consulting paper notes because normally my notes are on my laptop, as you guys would be well aware. But because I'm filming this on my laptop and I'm nowhere near a computer because I couldn't get in the same room as a computer, going old school. Okay. All right. Now, we spoke about a lot of things on the TV show Planet America today that I'm not going to repeat here. If you're interested, you can watch the show. We spoke in particular a lot about Haiti and the Haitians under the bridge on the border. I'm not going to go into any of that here, but I do just want to focus on one little bit before I get into the Dr. Jennifer Hunt topics. I want to focus on something I didn't really go into much detail with on the show. And this is where I fill out what I don't get into on the show. I want to talk about Title 42 a little bit more, and you'll see why in a second. Now, I told you that they were sending about 3/4 of the 16,000 people under the bridge around America. They were giving them like 60-day notices to appear in an immigration office at some point in time, whatever that means. And the other quarter or so, they're instantly deporting. No questions asked. Now, you might wonder, how is that even possible that they can do that? How legally can you do that? If someone turns up on your doorstep and they are claiming asylum, the law is you're supposed to evaluate if their asylum claims are real. You don't just put them on a plane, especially when you're sending them to the place where they might have escaped from 20 years ago. They might not have just come from Haiti. A lot of the Haitians have been in Brazil and Chile over the last few years for obvious reasons. And the answer is Title 42, which is a public health order. And that, that permits the director of the CDC to, quote, prohibit the introduction into the United States of individuals when the director believes that there is serious danger of the introduction of a communicable disease into the United States. Now, the CDC actually opposed the use of this under Trump. Sorry, there's a bit of noise in the hangar. At least it's not an airplane. The CDC opposed the use of this under Trump, but Pompeo actually slapped them down. And Biden was happy to continue to use it because he could use it to sort of juice his numbers a little bit in terms of who he doesn't let into the country. In August, they let 44% of the people who came through in August, the 208,000 people, got deported immediately using Title 42. Now, to be clear, this public order is clearly pretextual. Okay, there's a couple of reasons why we know they don't actually care about COVID. First of all, we know they don't actually care about COVID because they don't test everybody. If you cared about COVID, that's the first thing you would do. You would test everybody who crosses the border to make sure they don't have COVID. They don't do that. They test some people they don't test. Also, they allow some people in who may not have vaccines. They don't even offer a vaccine to them. Some people they do offer a vaccine to, others they don't. To be honest, I'm really confused about what the difference is between the groups that they offer vaccines to and the groups they don't offer vaccines to. You don't get a straight answer from any report that I've seen, but there are different groups. That's all I know. But the important thing is that they are actually clearly using this as a pretext to get rid of people. And they're being quite shameless about it. Like Mayorkas, I've got a quote here from Mayorkas. He said, Title 42 is not an immigration authority, but a public health authority to protect the American public, to protect the communities along the border, and to protect the migrants themselves. And Jen Psaki said, it's an effort to protect a lot of them from the spread of COVID. Now, these are the people who place them on planes without testing them for COVID before they send them on a long plane trip over to Haiti. These are not the actions of people who care about whether they catch COVID or not. Okay, so yes, I'm very dubious. The reason I'm telling you all this, what I didn't tell you about on the show is the court case. There's a long-running court case that the ACLU took against Biden. He gave them the ACLU gave Biden, I think, till June to stop using Title 42, and he kept on using it. So I said, okay, we're taking you to court. Guess who they've got as their judge? Do you remember last year, Dr. Jan, Emmett Sullivan, the guy who was in charge of Michael Flynn's court case? The really cantankerous guy who kept on trying to throw the book at Michael Flynn. Do you remember him?
No, but now I want to learn more.
Well, this guy does not suffer fools. I'll tell you that. He was a very, very angry man. He is their judge, and he has said, not buying this for a second. I got a quote from him. He said, the wide availability of testing, vaccines, and other minimization measures, because of the wide availability of testing, vaccines, and other minimization measures, the court is not convinced that the transmission of COVID-19 during border processing cannot be significantly mitigated. No kidding. So he's told them as of next week, they are not allowed to use Title 42 anymore for children or for families. I think at this point in time, he's allowing them to use it for single adults. The reason for that is because the court case is not about single adults. The ACLU first took them to court about families. And this judge has just said, no leg to stand on there, guys. So that's going to limit their usage of Title 42. And I expect that within days, the ACLU will then launch another court case or extend this one to be about single people, because they're going to lose that one too. So Title 42 ain't going to last much longer. And Biden is already overseeing the most number of apprehensions on the southern border in a fiscal year in history. It's going to get worse after that, possibly twice as bad, given that they're deporting about half of them. Anyway, one other thing about immigration before do you have anything to say about Title 42, Dr. Jen, before I move on? I know you didn't prepare for this. That's why I haven't explained to you yet.
No, keep going.
No, okay. One thing I'll say about immigration before I do throw to Dr. Jen, who's got a lot to tell us about various things. An interesting report I saw from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. They looked at 7 of the most frequently used immigration forms and petitions. And these 7 forms account for 70% of the workload of citizen immigration services, citizenship immigration services. And 6 of the 7 of them had increased a very large amount during the Trump administration. So this is kind of testimony to the evil genius that is Stephen Miller. While we might not like him very much, the guy's definitely smart. And he used his time to tinker with these forms, which is an easy thing to do. The president can do that, and his staff can do that easily without Congress. And let me tell you the difference. The application for employment authorization was expanded from 1 page and 18 questions to 7 pages and 61 questions. Form I-130, to have a relative immigrate, that's a big one they really try to stop, went from being 2 pages and 41 questions to 12 pages and 158 questions. Now, this doesn't just make it very difficult for someone who might not speak wonderful English to complete, but on top of that, it adds the processing time. The processing time increased for that last form, the one to allow your relatives to immigrate, which they really wanted to stop. The processing time increased from an average of about 3 months in 2015 to an average of 11 months last year. And that's a really easy, clever way to reduce the amount of immigration. Just do it with bureaucracy. Thing is, Biden can undo it like that. So he should. So I just put it out there because that's not getting much coverage, but I thought that was a really interesting report, which you can find for yourself online. Now, Dr. Jen, I want to talk to you about something more in your wheelhouse, which is security, in particular, election security. I'm pushing this a little bit. We've just it seems the wash up of January 6th never ends. Just this week, we saw I believe, a hitherto secret memo from this lawyer dude, John Eastman, which I haven't had a chance to, I mean, I read it, I can comment on it, but I haven't had a chance to look through the ins and outs of this one. So can you take us away on that?
Sure. So this was a 6-point memo by a former law professor, Eastman, who was advising Trump within the White House the day before. So this is January 5th. And according to the book Peril, which is the newest release from Bob Woodward, the conversation went something like Trump saying, hey, Pence, we have a plan to move forward. Why don't you give this guy a listen? Because all of this really hinged on Pence. It was about his role in counting, tabulating the final certification of votes on January 6th, which is what the insurrection sought to disrupt. And it laid out a plan whereby they could contest the electors that were already provided, seek alternatives from 7 states, even though 60 lawsuits had already been thrown out about this before this point, and seek to retain Trump with a second term, thinking that the House or the Senate would back him up. So this just came to light because of this book. And it really paints a picture of why there was such hostility toward Pence on January 6th, right? You saw the gallows that was constructed, but you also heard chants with the videos that are being released of hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. So this goes toward explaining his role. According to the book, Pence was apprehensive, as were the 2 senators who were brought in to review it. This is Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, who both declined to proceed, calling it sort of, hogwash. And
Lindsey Graham, I believe, called it 3rd grade stuff. Is that right?
Yes. And then Mike Lee said, you might as well, appeal this case to Queen Elizabeth II. This has no basis in actual fact and procedure under the Constitution.
But that's really, I think, a moment for self-evaluation when Lindsey Graham has said, there's too much bullshit here for me to swallow. That's really time for self-evaluation, I feel. Anyway.
But apparently, Pence reached out to a former vice president to get his opinion, Dan Quayle, whose name we haven't heard in a very long time since he last misspelled potato, really. And Dan Quayle said the same thing as Mike Lee and Lindsey Graham. You can't do this.
Okay, so now my understanding, I'll just take people through the mechanism of the memo because they might be wondering how exactly this legal advice was supposed to work. I just did a quick summary of what my understanding of this memo was. I think, okay, so Eastman said, number one, that it was an open question whether Pence had the authority to unilaterally set aside slates of electors. Now, I'm not sure it is actually an open question, but he said it was an open question. And he said, so if Pence, and he said, now maybe we can cite some of the alternative slates of electors that groups of people were coming together, not actual state legislatures, but groups from state legislatures were coming together to a point. So maybe we can cite them as alternative slates of electors. But if you don't, let's just have Pence say, I'm setting aside the slates of electors from the 7 critical states. Then if you do that, there will only be 454 electoral votes in total, and Trump would win them 232 to 222. He then predicted howls, quote, howls from Democrats. Hopefully there'll be howls from more than the Democrats, but anyway, howls from the Democrats. And he said, that's fine. No one got to 270, so we don't need to count 232 to 222. Let's just follow the Constitution. The 12th Amendment says it goes to the House, where every state gets 1 representative. And hey, the Republicans would have won that vote. So then Donald Trump would be reinstalled as president. And Pence, he said, should just announce this and let them take him to court. Because when they do take him to court, the court will say, this is none of our business. This is an election, not to do with the courts. And so we will leave it in the hands of the elected representatives. And so then Trump would be president. That was his logic as far as I understand. First of all, do you agree with that? Do you agree that is his logic? And secondly, does that make any sense to you whatsoever?
I think there are lots of logical fallacies, starting with the role that Pence would have, which is really just to call the roll. That is Pence's main function. He doesn't
Role was
have
the role.
the authority to set aside slates of electors. And so this was really nonsense from point one on down.
Yeah. I do feel that way. And as I said, also there was no slates of alternate electors, so it would have been a real stretch if you were saying Mike Pence had the power to just randomly pick states and just say nah. I feel like you've got a dictatorship at that point in time.
Especially because the Electoral College had already met in December and cast those necessary ballots. So there was no contesting of electors.
Yeah. It's but this does play into an area of concern from my point of view, which is that, like, I've been going on and on about the Electoral Count Act on this podcast at some length. In fact, I believe at one point in time I mentioned it in front of you at one of our previous podcasts, and about how all these kinds of, look, I would like to think that the Supreme Court, even at their most hackish, would not endorse this bullshit. But the reason why there's even the beginnings of the potential for an argument to be made, even a dubious argument, is because the Electoral Count Act is kind of ambiguous and leaves out a lot. There's a lot that's left unsaid, as is often the case with the law. But now we know we've got the dry run of people trying this game. We can stop it before it restarts, because what's happened essentially is something that was incontrovertible. Like I remember back in December, way back in December. Oh, I remember those days. I remember people saying, "Oh, the Trump's going to steal the election," and me saying, "No. Well, as soon as the Electoral College meets, it's over. That's it. Once the Electoral College meets, that's the end. December 14, that's the end." And now that's not the end. Now we've opened up the door to, even if it's bullshit, there's still going to be more after December 14. From now, forevermore, until you close that door again. And the way you close that door is with the Electoral Count Act. So I really wish right now they would drop all the voting rights stuff that they're trying to push. I mean, look, I agree with much of that the voting rights bills that are in Congress, but they're not going to get them up. We all know they're not going to get them up. I wish they would just say, okay, let's have some incontrovertible things here. Like the vice president cannot just select which states he wants to endorse from their electors. Like things that you would think you have to be able to get 10 Republicans to agree with. Like at least the 6 Republicans that agreed to impeach Trump, also to remove Trump, at least. And then you'd think you get Mitch McConnell. Like he's at the very least an institutionalist. And you only need 10 to beat the filibuster. And I reckon if all you did, you had nothing else but just clean up the Electoral Count Act to stop blatant theft of elections, I reckon you could get, maybe I'm a dreamer, but I think you could get 10 Republicans, and at least you should damn well go down trying. At the moment, they're not even trying. And so, I feel like this is a really, really important loophole to close up before it's too late. Because as soon as someone really does sniff the chance to win an election through this, it will then be too late. It'll become politicized, and you'll never get that loophole closed up. So number one, I feel like it's really important to close this up once and for all, Electoral Count Act. And secondly, I think it's really important to look after our election administrators, because they're the ones that will decide these alternative election slates. The guys who aren't getting paid, the guys who fill honorary roles on state election boards, those people who are currently getting hounded out of office with threats of violence, and their families are being harassed and all the rest of it, and they're getting nothing for this. So of course they're going to go. And who do you think they're going to get replaced by? They get replaced by hacks. And to me, that's the greatest worry we face at the moment as far as elections go. That the people who will judge the next election after that, are the people who drove the sensible people out. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. And it does take a lot of those sort of, street level bureaucrats for this whole machinery of the electoral system to work. For instance, in Australia, the AEC blooms from 700 permanent staff to more like 70,000 to run an election. And similarly in the United States, you rely on a lot of these local officials, local volunteers, to process the ballots, to be there on the voting days. And you're seeing them being intimidated out of these posts. Remember in that call with the Georgia Secretary of State, in which Trump asked this person to find 11,000 votes so he could win Georgia, he specifically mentioned an electoral worker who was being broadcast as part of the counting, and referenced her daughter. The seeming intimidation of not only electoral workers, but their families. The new technique is for these rigged election, stop the steal supporters to run for higher offices that are involved in election administration. So the Secretary of State in each state runs that election. And Reuters just did a report. They interviewed 15 Republican candidates who are running for the top election post in those 15 states. Only 2 said that Biden won the election in 2020. So they are
currently hold the positions.
No, they are running to contest.
Oh, they're running. Okay. Sorry. Yeah,
they're running, but using that as part of their platform, their electoral pitch. And this is the long life of the big lie, right? Of voter fraud, rigged elections, that this will then be used as an excuse to overturn the will of the people.
Wow. So what do you have any theories about what we do here? Because it's very difficult to convince someone who is, essentially a paper pusher, getting no money, getting no glory, no anything, just getting headaches, to stick around just for the potential sake of the country somewhere down the road. Do you have any theories of how we can deal with this?
I think a lot of it comes down to trust in that highest office within the state, because all states are running their own elections. And so that level of trust at the county and the state level is very important. I think there have to be standards for people who are in charge of elections or administering those elections. And some of the candidates that we have right now are actively participating in insurrections. They gloat about being in DC on January 6th. They're involved in some of these activities. So I think we have to move forward with holding those people to account so that they are taken out of contention for some of these posts and positions. Right now, the Department of Justice in DC are up to 700 arrests for the January 6th insurrection, and plea bargains are continuing. So I think once they start moving the mechanisms along, we're going to see potentially some of these aspiring contenders for political office being caught up in those investigations.
If they're found guilty of some trespass type crime, criminal trespass type crime, for January 6th, that's not going to stop them holding a position of authority, though, will it?
It depends on if it's a carceral term. So remember, in some states, if you're a felon, you lose your ability to vote. I think some voters might dissuade some voters from casting their ballot for someone who is actually not legally allowed to cast their own ballot.
Sure. You do raise January 6th, actually, which leads me to another question for you, because I missed this story completely because I'm always 24 hours behind. Shh, don't tell anyone. But I'm always 24 hours behind whenever I record the show because I spend the day before writing scripts and whatever. Anyway, the story broke today about the January 6th subpoenas. I just know the story broke. I know nothing else. Can you tell me what's going on there?
Yeah, so these are some of the first subpoenas to be issued from the select committee that's investigating January 6th. This is the one that also includes 2 Republicans, Katzinger and Cheney, who at the time of the insurrection was the 3rd highest ranking Republican in the House and was dismissed from that post due to her support for impeachment and conviction. So we have 4 subpoenas that have been issued, and these are quite big tickets in terms of personnel. You have Mark Meadows, who was the former chief of staff for Trump. You had Steve Bannon, who has so many hats, I don't even know where to start. But for the uninitiated, he was part of the Trump campaign. He was the head of Breitbart. He was involved in Cambridge Analytica, and most recently was arrested for fraud by the U.S. Postal Service on a yacht just before the election. Yeah. And now podcasts about putting bureaucrats' heads on pikes as a way to...
Yeah, I was going to say, January 6th, he was just a podcaster, so we need to watch out.
That's true. And another 2 other people, which of course I have forgotten.
That's okay. while you're finding that, let me ask you.
Yes.
Let me ask you, these subpoenas, as I said, I literally know nothing about this story. So are these subpoenas for them personally to testify, or was it for their emails, or what was the detail?
Yes, they are called to be part of the investigation. They are supposed to report to the House to testify in October.
Okay. October, pretty soon. Oh, well, that's
Yes. So the other two are Dan Scavino and Patel, who was part of the Defense Department at the time.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's possibly one more story that we're going to miss while we're on our break for 3 weeks. We're on a 3-week break, by the way.
Oh.
For those who don't watch the show, and everything is happening. The whole of America is falling to its knees during this 3-week period in which we're away. We've got the Democrats' agenda falling apart. We've got shutdowns, debt ceilings. We've got the testimony for Afghanistan, and now we've got the testimony for January 6th. So we've really timed that really well. Can you tell us anything else about these subpoenas, or is that pretty much all you know at this point in time?
Well, I think the question is whether they're going to show up. Remember, under the Trump administration, there was this tendency to disregard subpoenas and the power behind them. So without enforcement, it's difficult to see how this will progress forward.
Well, I suppose under Trump, they had the ability to resist because Trump could always cite his presidential privilege. You can't do that now. So I don't know how that works. I can't imagine Liz Cheney's the kind of person that would hesitate to throw someone in jail if they don't observe a subpoena.
I think we're going to find out.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think I think you're right that they're not going to just show up. That's a fair call. I'll tell you something I saw quite interesting about this while we're talking about this election stuff. It was a poll which I've been kicking around for a few weeks. And I've been meaning to pull out when I can, which just, I mean, maybe this to you is going to be real no shit Sherlock, but to me when I read this, I just thought, whoa, CNN poll, 59% of Republicans say it's at least somewhat important to being a Republican to believe that Trump won the election. Like 3/5 say that if you don't believe Trump won the election, you're not a real Republican, essentially. I thought that was a eye-opener, because I don't know how, if that's the majority of their party, I don't know where you go forward.
Yeah, it's staggering, but I also think that's driving people to leave the party. So this is just the Republicans that still identify as such after January 6th. And we saw a huge shift in party registration, which party that voters were registered in the aftermath of January 6th. So I think that pool winnows down and those percentages thus get larger.
Okay. Well, they have to get a lot larger, but that's okay. Do you have anything else to say about this particular area, either to January 6th or the investigation or Eastman or any of these shenanigans?
No, I think it's on to COVID now.
Yep. Okay. All right. Let's do that. Actually, yeah, we'll go COVID next. Why not? Okay. Before we do though, Stats Nugget. This is an interesting one. This is from the American Enterprise Institute, which are kind of a sort of a semi-libertarian kind of think tank, sort of conservative / semi-libertarian. Okay. Anyway, 69.8% of Americans will be in the top 20% of income for at least 1 year of their lives. So essentially 70% of Americans at some point in time in their life are in the top 20% of income. 50% will be in the top 20% for at least 4 years of their life. Now, the point that American Enterprise Institute was trying to make there with that stat is that inequality is as much about your point of life as your demographic or where you live or whatever. I mean, obviously there are some people, there are 30% that never get there, but their point is that if you follow a regular career path, you will almost certainly, by the time you get into your 50s, have what is considered to be a high income in America. And that people who are poor are very often young or old. and it's just and it's a case of trying to get as many people onto that track as possible. They're a conservative institute. That's why they're pushing that. But I found it interesting that as many as 70% of Americans will be in the top 20% of income at some point in time. There is one disclaimer though on this. When you say top 20% of income, I don't think that's super high. Like it sounds high. You go, oh, top 20%. But I didn't have time to find what number that is, but I'm pretty sure that I'd be lucky if it was $100,000. I think it would probably be less than that. And so if that's your income for like a year or for 2 years, I don't think you're living on easy street. Let's put it that way. Anyway, interesting one. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, and I think the trajectory has changed on generational lines as well. I mean, if you look at the percentage of wealth that's held by the baby boomers when they were 30 versus what millennials hold at a comparative age, it's not even close. I think whereas the baby boomers had about 30% of the national wealth, millennials have 5%, and 2% of that is Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah. Yes.
So, I think there are anomalies that really skew a lot of this analysis.
I will say one thing though. I think like your stats are absolutely spot on. I know that, but the income situation isn't the same as the wealth situation. In that until quite recently, like 3 years or 4 years ago, millennials were getting absolutely screwed on wealth and income. They were miles behind their equivalent ages from previous generations, but they've caught up in the last couple of years. I think their income now is actually higher than, even adjusted for inflation, than any other generation were at the same age. But as you say, they're starting from behind big time when it comes to wealth. And so
it's true. And it just doesn't go as far. I mean, if you look at how healthcare costs have ballooned over the last 30 years, for instance, I mean, we tend to forget about that in Australia, but that is a major expense in the United States. They still have medical bankruptcies. So you might have a very high income, get struck with cancer, and that's all gone.
Yeah, that's true. By the way, if you're wondering why I keep on adjusting myself and hitting the camera, if you're watching the video, it's because I literally have my legs crossed like a kindergarten kid. I keep on getting pins and needles. The things I do for this podcast. Anyway, we're going to go into COVID. Let's go into COVID. Okay. All right. Hang on, I've got to go through my notes like this because I don't have my laptop. All right. Okay. All right. First of all, numbers. The deaths keep edging up. They've been seemingly about to flatline for a month, but no, they keep on just edging up. They're up to about 2,000 a day now, which is, it's getting pretty high. Cases have been hovering around 150,000 a day for a month. It's hospitalizations, 90,000 a day for about a month. It's, like I said on the show, it's really Groundhog Day. Interesting though, when I was hunting around these numbers for my usual updates, I found that New York City is no longer in the top 100 counties for COVID deaths per capita over the entire pandemic. I don't mean now, I mean even counting the beginning when they had freezer trucks driving around with corpses in them. If you count it all, New York City is not in the top 100 counties of deaths per capita. Do you find that amazing, or do you think that's a no shit Sherlock moment?
I mean, I think it's an amazing accomplishment, so we shouldn't discount that. But it goes to the seriousness with which the leaders took the pandemic. We see a similar trend happening in California, where they're the first state to have gone from the highest level of infection to one tier down, and every other state still being pretty high risk.
Yeah, they're literally the lowest cases per capita over the last week in America, California. Like they're number 50. I can tell you that because every single week I compare the states to Australian states. So I know exactly where they all are. But, I'm going to stop doing that, unfortunately. I mentioned on the show, I'm going to stop doing it now because Australia has improved a little bit. America is not improving. And so now New South Wales has slipped way below the other states now. So there's no point comparing them anymore. But I will compare the vaccines because that's interesting. We'll get onto vaccines in a second. Other stuff which I found interesting is, looking at those cases per capita and deaths per capita, state by state. I've noticed, because as I said, I have been looking at them every single week, state by state. I've noticed that the highs aren't changing and the lows aren't changing, but the geography of the states that occupy each of them is changing. in that increasingly over time, we don't have 4 or 5 southern states way above everyone else, like we did a month ago or 2 months ago. They're starting, I mean, they're still high, don't get me wrong. The southern states are still high, but they're starting to come down, and the northern states are starting to go up as the weather changes. And I think we're seeing the same pattern that we saw last year, which was there was this big July spike in the southern states, in Florida and Texas, and then the southern states was hot, where people were staying indoors because it was hot, and they caught it indoors. And then in winter, when people go outside in the southern states, but they go inside in the northern states, you got a spike in the northern states. I think we're starting to see that. So I think we can expect a big spike in the northern states soon. We'll see if I'm right about that. I hope I'm wrong. Yeah, that's just something I just observed. Another thing I just observed just looking at numbers is that Vermont, which is the #1 state for vaccinations, it's just over 70% fully vaccinated. Singapore is just coming off its own spike. It's over 80% vaccinated. So if that northern wave comes through, none of these states is too vaccinated for a wave. So like even the good states in America aren't overly vaccinated. In fact, New South Wales, believe it or not, we still think of our vaccinations as shit. New South Wales, as far as one shot goes, like people have had one shot, which is obviously you start off with a lot more people having had one shot because there's a 4 to 6 week lag before they're fully vaccinated. We're only 10% behind Vermont of people who've had one shot. And yeah, that's the #1 state in America. I reckon by the time we come back, Planet America comes back on air in 3 weeks' time, I reckon New South Wales will be higher than any American state. And we still think our vaccinations is shit. So they're still seeing ducks, I think, America for the next wave. So that's setting the scene for cases and vaccines and stuff like that. What are your thoughts about where America's at with vaccines, and anything you want to say about COVID at this point in time?
Well, I think the states are an interesting case study in that we saw the demonstrations, the protests that happened last year are just now sort of getting to us in Australia. So I watch very carefully what happens in the United States. What we're seeing are the beginning of vaccine mandates. For instance, Biden for federal workers and the military. And this has been a really interesting discussion on Fox News, which I follow, but I don't recommend anyone else do, because Tucker Carlson is one of the primetime shows, along with Hannity and Ingram, are really pushing this line that this is a form of tyranny. Tyranny has a very special word in the American lexicon and imagination. And you saw some members of the military resigning, which I thought was quite interesting, because the military is one of the few organizations which gives you health care as part of your job, as well as part of your pension.
And also, by the way, makes you have about 60 different vaccines as well.
Absolutely. And this has been trialed in court, even relatively new vaccines like the anthrax vaccine in 2002. This has already been through court-martial and Supreme Courts. This is already settled case law. But the fact that this is seen as a wedge that can be used to further divide people, to fracture the military. You see these people showing up to school boards, also running for school boards. This is another elected position in the United States, because of schools implementing COVID safety protocols. In the absence of vaccines that are readily available for school children, they have still implemented masks, distancing, and the rest. Even at university level, we have universities being cowed by conservative leadership. You have whole states like Mississippi saying universities are not allowed to have a vaccine mandate, even though I remember when I went to university, you had to show your childhood immunization records to get into university, to be allowed on that campus. This has gone so far down the rabbit hole that we have now a couple of things happening. The first is you have Florida legislature members who are trying to get rid of all childhood immunization requirements. So they're saying, all right, we will be consistent. We won't single out COVID-19. We'll get rid of them all. So that just happened this week. They are calling for a review. And the second thing is, as far away as Alaska, you had Republicans attempting to try to prosecute doctors for giving the vaccine, right? Under the Nuremberg Code. So this was a House
Why
vote
not?
that just happened a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
The Alaska House narrowly rejected a play for doctors, essentially, and health practitioners to be intimidated from doing their jobs and delivering these vaccines, that they could be criminally prosecuted. Remember, we've seen this kind of language in federally elected representatives as well. You had Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert both talk about how any form of COVID-19 mitigation was a form of Nazism. You know, brown-shirted needle wielders were coming to your town.
To be
So,
fair, that was before Marjorie Taylor Greene learnt that the Holocaust was bad and should not be used lightly.
oh no, this just happened
After.
more recently. She's relapsed. She's relapsed. The Auschwitz Museum is on tour again, um, and now it's a form of medical tyranny and segregation.
Right.
So the reason that I bring this up is I think we're going to start seeing that kind of language in Australia. So we need to be prepared. We've done a great job of vaccination efforts, as you've just mentioned, but we have to be prepared to stand by our public health orders in terms of childhood immunization, vaccination moving forward, because these are the narratives that spill over.
I wasn't even going to talk about this, but since you brought this up, I might as well make this thing I mentioned on the show. You want to talk about medical tyranny? Like, I'm speaking to these people, not to you. you want to talk about medical? I'll tell you medical tyranny. Medical tyranny is in Idaho, where right now, because they have no vaccinations and their hospitals are full, if two different people show up who are sick, I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about car accidents, heart attacks, I don't care. It doesn't matter what is wrong with you. The first thing they will do is they'll see if one of you is under 17 years old. If one of you is under 17, they get in, the other one pisses off. Next step is one of them more than 28 weeks pregnant. The person who's more than 20 weeks pregnant gets the medical care. The other person, go away. Third is they look at age bands. I think there's an age band from 16 to 40, from 40 to 60, 60 up. I think it's something like that. There's about 20 years, these age bands. The lower the age band, the higher priority you get. If they're in the same age band and they're not, one of them isn't 17 and one of them isn't pregnant, then you ask, is one of them a public health worker? And if that's not the case and they're in the same age band, you put them in a lottery. And the person who loses the lottery doesn't get the health care. Now, they don't kick them in the gutter. They give them something to make them feel better, but they just sit in a chair and die. That's what happens. Like they don't have enough. They don't have enough beds. They don't have enough healthcare. That's medical tyranny.
And that's happening in multiple states. I think a guy was in his 50s. He was turned down from 43 hospitals because they were full. He had a simple procedure. There was a military vet who died of something relatively minor as well. I think it was either appendicitis or gallstones, a treatable condition, acute but treatable, and he died because there were no ICU beds available or staff. And I think that's the other thing that we tend to forget about. It's not just a matter of having the machines and the equipment and the beds and the rooms, which is how we tend to categorize them. We need people to staff this equipment. And they're being driven from the profession with the same sorts of intimidation techniques and harassment and fatigue that we see with election workers and local politicians and school board members. They're being told to their face that they are part of a hoax, that they are inflating COVID numbers, that they're getting paid for people to get sick. And I think it's going to drive people not only out of the profession, but prevent some people from joining, which will impact all of us in our old age, that we are losing valuable talent in this field.
I would normally at this point in time, if I had control of my computer, I would bring up a Facebook post, which I saw recently, which was fantastic, but I'm going to have to recount it off the top of my head, I'm afraid. It was from a nurse in Texas. And in Texas, one of the laws that they have passed recently says that you have to allow visitors, right? And which seems to me to be not helpful at times. But anyway, and so these people who have serious COVID, they have to allow them visitors. And what this nurse was saying is that these people, they rug them up before they let them in the room. Obviously, they make them look like one of the extras from Outbreak, with all the yellow suit and the gloves and the breathing mask. But number one, they often take it off when they get in there. Number two, they start messing with the equipment. Number three, they start trying to slip hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and shit like that into the patient because they think that the hospitals don't know what they're doing. And essentially they become a massive nuisance in the nurse's life while the nurses try to save these people's lives because these people are in intensive care, right? So they need all the help they can get. And it's just one more massive irritant in the lives of these people who are being pushed to the edge. I should say, by the way, from the other side, we should admit there are people who are quitting because they're being forced to get vaccines as well. Like there are healthcare workers who, for whatever reason, I can't believe it, that they're healthcare workers and they don't want to have a vaccine, but they're healthcare workers and they refuse to get vaccines. And there are a number of states with healthcare mandates now. So vaccine mandates for healthcare workers. And I don't want to overinflate the numbers, but yeah, some people are quitting, and the fact that they're understaffed as it is, that doesn't help. So there's pressure on staff from all ends in the current situation.
Absolutely. Well, and especially if there's some sort of intimidation factor that might get called under the Nuremberg codes. I mean, I don't know if I'd stay in my job if someone was threatening me with these sorts of statutes.
Old Nuremberg codes. Let me ask you, since you've been watching Fox News and I haven't, do you get any sense of, like, obviously, on your Tucker Carlson type shows, they'll get the army guy who quit because of vaccine mandates who wants to bitch about it. Have you heard any numbers? As opposed to, here's one person who did that. Here's one person who did that. Have you got any sense that there is actually a sizable number of people from either especially the army, which is quite conservative, the army or one of the more conservative organizations that's been forced to have vaccines? Lots of people actually quitting.
I think you're right. What we're seeing is anecdotal.
Yeah.
From my connections in the U.S. military, the impression is that a few people are going for the exemptions, but they're not getting them. So they are being very strict about, if you didn't have a religious exemption to a previous, then this one doesn't count. There has to be some consistency.
Yeah.
As well as, of course, vaccines are mandated. They are considered lawful orders. This is FDA approved. And so all the usual excuses fall away, especially when you're dealing with the military. I think what we're seeing on Fox News, though, and just to sort of tie together what we started with, is that you're seeing them push this continue this anti-immigration rhetoric and calling immigrants a vector of disease, as well as pushing the front that that vaccines are seeking to eliminate real manly men from the military, right? This is a way to prosecute testosterone and Christianity. I mean, all of it's, hokum, right? But this is a way to further
Actually, let me play the clip you're talking about, and then you can speak to it. I'm inserting it here right now. They're watching the clip. Okay, they've now watched the clip. Jen, keep going.
So, I mean, some of these are such stretches that they're really trying to tie in every single facet of the culture war into the global pandemic, immigration, and the Biden administration. It's just the same hits recycled with slightly different variations each time.
Yeah. The reason, actually, before I move on from the military, I just can't leave you dropping on the ground your connections in the military. Let me just ask one question. Have you ever killed a man, Dr. Jan?
You'll never find the body, so I can safely say no. I will say that I'm from a Marine Corps family. So my dad was a Marine, and he made it known quite early in our childhood that he would be raising us on two of the Marine Corps unofficial mottos. The first one is adapt, improvise, and overcome, which has been a very productive philosophy, I found. Yep. And the other one was an old boot camp motto, which was, I can't make you do anything, but I can sure make you wish you had. That was my...
Nice. And I now I'm getting hung up on the military thing, but I just had no idea. And I'll just keep on following this path where it goes. I just want to ask just a random question about what you think, and also what your father thinks, in particular, what your father thinks about the current NDAA, which is at this stage, including women as having to put themselves down for potential conscription.
That's interesting. So I've had previous conversations with my father about this. I don't know if he's changed his opinion lately. It hasn't come up in quite a while. But I remember him being concerned as a Marine that it would fracture cohesion, right? I think that's a pretty common response. As I pointed out, that's the same thing they said about desegregating the forces. That it would be it would lead to tension and fracturing and erode good order and discipline. So I don't think that excuse worked as an anti-desegregation measure, and I don't think it works for the women either. And I would be happy to volunteer, and I know lots of other women were as well, to serve.
Yeah, well, just to be clear, this is about conscription. I don't think there's any question that women can volunteer. It's a question of what the Conservatives are getting worked up about is women being forced to potentially join the military in a war. And I would have thought the answer is, if you don't like it, then don't have conscription. How about that?
Well, and I think that they put up this measure thinking that it would be considered so preposterous that they'd had the winning hand, and I think they found that's not the case.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we should have many more conversations about conscription when we commit troops to events about the cost, about conscription. Because if we're not willing to have those hard conversations at the start about sacrificing blood and treasure, then maybe we shouldn't proceed.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'll get back on the thread which I was going on before I got off the track on the military. The reason I asked was because I do like to go for stats. When I asked about the numbers of people who had quit the military, say, is I am interested in stats, and I have looked for stats on people on when there's been mandates a significant amount of time in the past. Now, a lot of these vaccine mandates are quite recent, but some of them have been around for a month or two now. If there are large numbers of people who are quitting, and the very little I've found doesn't look like it. Like there was one I saw from Maine. They implemented a statewide vaccine mandate for healthcare workers like a month and a half ago. Talking 33,000 healthcare workers there. 65 people quit out of 33,000. So that's like 0.2%. I know United Airlines and Delta Airlines have they don't have full-on mandates, but they've got some pretty strict policies for people that don't have vaccines, and neither of them have found very many people quitting either. So, I mean, there might be a lot of all talk on this kind of stuff. Like it's, but just, I'm just curious because Americans do get very intense at times. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. So, have you found that people in Australia, like Australians, like to act like we're laid back, and we're definitely not laid back as we think we are. But I do feel that there is a significantly higher degree of apathy about politics in Australia than there is in most other places, especially America. Have you found that in your travels?
Yeah, I think to some extent. I do think that's shifting in Australia, though, as people discover how closely those policies affect them.
Yeah. I actually had this discussion with Nick Bryant off air recently, because he was saying that, I probably shouldn't be telling tales out of school here, but he was talking about how he was surprised when he came to Australia recently and found them having the same vaccine protests that he just left in America. And I was saying, yeah, but in Australia, the vaccine protests are a bit different, because since Australians generally don't give a shit about much, the protests are smaller, and they end up with people all singing the horses on a bridge. And they're just a bit more, they're just a bit more half-assed, because you just it's like Sky News, like Sky After Dark. They get like 30,000 viewers or 40,000. They get not many viewers. Like their greatest influence is actually overseas on YouTube. Like the Americans watch their clips rather than Australians watching their clips, because Australians don't give a shit. It's one of the things that one of the few things I absolutely love about Australia, actually, that they don't give a shit. So it's a shame if it is changing, if you're noticing that. But anyway.
Yes, and of course our protests here don't involve, semi-automatic weapons. So there's that as well.
Yes, that is a relief. One other thing I saw about vaccine passports and mandates, Italy now has vaccine mandates for all workers, which is quite amazing. That's the first in Europe, that's for sure. I'll be interested to see where that goes. I suppose there's nowhere to quit if you're in Italy. Like there's no point quitting because it's right across the board. So, which is interesting.
Yeah, they have a green pass.
Yeah.
And I think, similarly in France, they have restrictions around access to public venues as well as, private cafes and pubs and such, unless you have proof of vaccination as well.
Just looking through my notes, you have any sort of random vaccine stuff while we're on vaccines? Oh yeah, actually, can I just tell you, this is not America, this is Australia, but still. I want to tell you my pet peeve, which I haven't mentioned on air, either on the podcast or on TV. And now's as good a time as any about vaccines. I hate the way, I'm a stats geek, right? And I hate the way Australian states and the government insist on citing statistics about vaccines that are based on over 16-year-olds. Like COVID asks for your ID before it infects you. It does not matter whether you are 16 or 15 or 12 as far as vaccines. Now, I understand that people under 12 can't get vaccines, but they still count. They are still a vector for COVID. Like it still spreads through them. And so the only stat that matters is the percentage of the population that has a vaccine. It does not matter if the percentage of blue-eyed people have a vaccine or the percentage of people who are between 39 and 41 or whatever way you want to chop it down. All that matters is the number of human bodies that have vaccines. And they continue to only cite the number of people, the percentage of people over 16. Now, this is confusing to a lot of people who I don't think realize that's what's going on. And I'm sure part of the reason they're doing it is to juke their own stats, to go, oh, the number's much bigger than you think. Look at that. Oh, we're doing so well. But that's the first thing. But also, it doesn't even make sense because now the eligible population is over 12. Yet they're still only citing people over 16, which is I really, really hate it. It also makes it hard to do international comparisons. So this is actually a real pet peeve of mine. And so just for those who are wondering, whenever I cite a statistic for either America or Australia or anywhere around the world, it is always the percentage of the population. I never do percentage of eligible population. I always do percentage of the total population. Now, I know I'm ridiculously angry about this, but people finally found what pisses me off.
Well, interestingly, on that note about COVID stats and the under 16s, I just saw yesterday that one of the sites about COVID statistics in Australia that's been quite big on Twitter, that has just been revealed to have been run by 3 teenagers aged 12 to 15 because they photographed themselves in line for the vaccine. And that's how they unmasked themselves as the creators of the COVID tracking stats.
The maths is not that complicated. I can trust a 12-year-old. That's okay. Like my daughter's 11. She's reading Bob Woodward at the moment. That probably says more about my house than anything else, but still.
Are these bedtime stories or nightmares or what are you reading?
I don't understand anything about my children. The generation gap is very, very large. So I suppose it's not that large if she's reading Bob Woodward, but still. I will not answer any questions, at least accurately, about her. Okay, just another vaccine thing, just doing some random vaccine stuff here. I said that the vaccines are available to over 12s. Pfizer got their safety data in this week for 5 to 11s. And so we can expect probably authorization in October for that. And apparently their safety data for 6 month to 5-year-olds isn't far off either. So by the end of this year, pretty much everyone over 6 months can get a vaccine. So I don't know what Australia's stats are going to do then, but just something to look out for. They'll obviously make a huge difference in schools, obviously. Another Pfizer, just a random Pfizer thing. I saw a study the other day that Pfizer went from 91% reduced risk of hospitalization freshly after the vaccine to 77% after 4 months, which that's still pretty decent. Like by standards of normal vaccines, if you get 77%, reduced risk of hospitalization. That's great. The reason I mention it though is Moderna went from 93 to 92%. So for those at home who have a true choice between Moderna and Pfizer, I just want to bear that in mind.
I noted that pharmacists are now have now been deputized for vaccine delivery, and
Yes.
it's going to be Moderna.
Oh, there you go. Let's go. Yeah, they've got this massive program in America, don't they? I think I saw, it's off the top of my head, I think it was 28,000 pharmacies are participating in a free vaccination and testing program in America, which is interesting. So yeah, are you talking?
And so now it's coming to Australia. Yeah.
There you go. Oh, there you go. Okay, well, there you go. I thought you were America. Well, there you go. I'm very American focused. Anything else from vaccines? Oh yeah. We talked about this a little bit on the show, but it was interesting that they're giving 1.1 billion vaccines away from Pfizer to poor countries around the world. On the show I mentioned, I went through the continental vaccination rates for one shot each, like for people who had at least one shot. South America was 59%, North America was 56%, Europe was 56%, Asia was 49%, and Africa 6%. So yeah, so that's why they need that. But there were two things they didn't point out. One, these are 2-shot vaccines, so you can halve the number of people. Secondly, they only get them by September 2022. And I think that they're probably going to be closer to the end than the beginning of that time period, because Pfizer donated about 500 million vaccines like 6 months ago, and they've given 100 million of those 500 million so far. So they come pretty slowly. So they might be a bit late for the next variant. Anyway, just throw that out there. I'm always sunshine and light. Do you have anything else to say about vaccines? So you read a book about vaccines just now, didn't you?
I have it handy on my bookshelf just in case it came
up.
So this just arrived.
Yep.
It's called Vaxxers. It's by the developers of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford researchers.
Should we put this on a list? This is a good book.
It's absolutely a great book.
Okay.
And they gave a shout out to political scientists. Not that I'm using this in class or anything, but on page 27, it talks about how they were sort of unprepared for the deluge of disinformation, after they had carefully prepared scientific communication for it all to be gone, unwrought by a careless word by a politician. They said, next time, and there will be a next time, we will hire political scientists on the team. So I volunteer as tribute. But it's an excellent book. It talks you through the process of vaccine testing, about trials, about ingredients. So I would say for the vaccine hesitant, or it could be an excellent resource if you're still deciding. I'm on team AstraZeneca, so this book felt a little personal.
Does it tell you about the conspiracies about how Anthony Fauci is controlling the world?
Yes, it talks about the 5G was actually put into exactly how they got it into the
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'll read it then. That's good. So I can communicate with some of our commenters. I love our commenters. Actually, I just found something which I haven't mentioned yet, which is an interesting poll. A bit of interesting polling, because I think Americans, or at least American media, were kind of surprised how popular the vaccine mandates actually were. I think they were expecting, look, I admit, I was expecting Biden to take some shit about these vaccine mandates. I mean, it's not a full-on mandate, but the semi-mandate that he's announced. But it's pretty consistently 60% popularity. Like in every
I saw
poll.
70.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, I was going to read just a Fox poll. This is registered voters, mind you. Registered voters, not just randos. So you'd expect the numbers to be lower on this. 67% support school mask mandates, 66% support employee mask mandates, 61% support teacher vaccine mandates, 58% support federal worker vaccine mandates, 56% support the Joe Biden 100 employee vaccine testing mandate. In that poll there, independents were 47-47, Republicans were 32-65, which is higher than I expected. But then again, right across the board, all the polls have Republicans about 30% supporting vaccine mandates. So we probably shouldn't talk about them like they're a solitary group. Like there's clearly a divide within Republicans on vaccines, and Democrats are 81-17. But there is one group that isn't so thrilled, which we have talked about a bit before. and that is black people. Now, I want to cite a Morning Consult poll. Since Biden announced the vaccine mandate on September 8th, so that's 12 days since this poll was taken, he lost 12 points net approval amongst black people. He went from 76-17 to 71-24. He lost, now that's still a lot of approval, don't get me wrong. He lost 17 points amongst unvaccinated black people, unsurprisingly. Went from 62-27 to 56-38. That's not getting so high, 56% support amongst any group of black people for a Democrat. But this is the interesting thing. His approval on every issue bled support during the same period amongst black people. So from August 30 to September 18 is what I'm telling you here.
What is that, before or after Nicki Minaj's tweet?
That's a great question. I think Nicki Minaj's tweet might have come just at the end of this period. So maybe it's a real factor. That's a great thought. His approval amongst the general population on COVID during that period dropped 3 points. Amongst black people, dropped 9 points. His approval amongst the general population for national security dropped 1 point. Amongst black people, 7 points. His approval amongst the general community on jobs went down 2 points. Black people, 6 points. The economy didn't move amongst the general population. Black people, down 4 points. Foreign policy, down 1 point. The general population, for black people, down 4 points. I thought that was interesting. Now, look, that's not gonna lose an election. But you know, when these things can be quite marginal at times, if this is still an issue in a year, like the Democrats need every single vote they can get from black people, generally speaking. If Biden loses the best part of 10 points amongst black people because of his COVID regulations, that could be a big deal come election time.
It could, and of course, this problem predates, Biden and COVID entirely. I don't think any segment that covers this issue can go past without mentioning the word Tuskegee, right? So Tuskegee was an example that we use in research methods as an ethics practice of what not to do, but it was a Department of Health initiative in the United States that ran for 40 years in the South with Black African-American participants without informed consent. It was marketed as a sort of a traveling health checkup for a rural population that didn't have access to that expertise. But in fact, it was a syphilis study. So half the participants had syphilis, half didn't. Neither group was told. And most importantly, in the 40s, once a treatment was made possible through penicillin, they weren't offered that treatment. And the study continued for 20 more years until a whistleblower turned them in.
It's pretty bad.
So that is a very well-known example of mistrust between this community and medical professionals, which is why there is a concerted effort in the United States to tap African-American physicians and medical practitioners to go into community mode as spokespeople for why this vaccine is safe and available and free.
Fair enough. The only other thing I want to say about this is just a random thing that until primary schools can vaccinate, which, as I said, won't be too far off, I don't think. Until they do, testing is a massive, massive issue. And I feel like it's a really underreported issue, just how much America has ballsed up rapid at-home tests. Like everyone's doing PCR tests still, like whereas in Europe, there's $3 tests all over the place. Often American tests that aren't available in America. There was something I read, which I thought found really interesting, because I mentioned this last week on the podcast, but this is an interesting addendum. Part of the problem is the classification for tests. Like in America, at the moment, they're classified as medical devices, and the standards for FDA approval of a medical device are very, very high, as you can understand. But if they just reclassified it as a public health tool, the standards aren't nearly as high, like vitamins and shit qualify for that. So it's not a very high standard, which means that they could then just flood the market with all these American tests that are currently being bought everywhere else. And that would make a huge difference in schools if they could just, rather than sticking cotton buds up people's noses constantly, if they could just give these people really easy saliva tests to just go bang, positive, negative, move on. It could make a huge difference. Like 500,000 I mentioned on the show, 500,000 kids got COVID this week or last week. You know, like and if there was proper testing, that wouldn't happen. Like the people who had it would stay home. So anyway, so I just want to flag that. That's something Biden can do once again, like that. So let's hope he does.
Let's hope he's listening.
Oh, look, I know he's glued to our podcast. He's the only man who keeps him awake. Do you have anything else to say about COVID?
Nope, I think we've covered it.
Okay, we've covered COVID.
For now.
I want to talk about Congress before we wrap up.
Okay.
There's a bit going on there. Just a little bit. Okay, so first of all, just a couple of details. There is people are loving the new child tax credit generally, the more generous child tax credit. I got some stats here. Hunger rates among families with children have already dropped by nearly 24% because of the child tax credit. If it was made permanent, the child poverty rate would be cut by 40% to the lowest level on record. But the thing is, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimate that to make that permanent, it will cost $1.1 trillion. Whereas to sunset it in 2025, it will cost $450 billion. So guess what they're doing? They're going to pretend they're going to sunset it in 3 years' time, and they'll save $650 billion in the reconciliation bill. Of course, they're expecting that to then get extended. So we're talking about some funny money here. Yeah, that is typically Congress, I'm afraid. Look, I am conscious of time, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But I do want to talk. What I want to talk in particular about is about the two massive Mexican standoffs going on. Well, there's one little one and then two big ones. The little one is about drug prices. I mentioned last time on the show, last time on the podcast, that there were 3 Democrats that killed the measure of drug price reform in committee, but they could still get up in the general House if they wanted to, if they just don't have 5 Democrats to kill it, because that's their margin. 2 other Democrats came forward, so they can kill it. But more importantly, Kirsten Sinema came forward, and either Sinema or Manchin say no to anything, can't happen because they need both of them for the 50 votes for the reconciliation bill. So Kirsten Sinema apparently said to Joe Biden that she's uncomfortable with the drug price reform. So that's not looking very good. The reason why it's a standoff is because the Democrats are using that $450 billion they're going to save from that to pay for their Medicaid patch and for the vision and hearing coverage in Medicare, which costs a little bit less. So if they don't get the drug price reform, not only will that piss off a lot of lefties, but if they could piss off a lot of people who aren't left, drug prices are pretty expensive in America. But on top of that, they might have to drop all their healthcare reform completely because they might not be able to afford it. So that's a standoff element there. But the big standoff is about the entire bill. Okay, so we've got on one hand, we've got Pelosi did a deal with the Problem Solvers Caucus, whatever that means, to hold a vote on September 27 for the bipartisan bill, right? That's already passed through the Senate. That's Monday for those counting. Kirsten Sinema, according to Politico, said that if the House delays its scheduled September 27 vote on the bipartisan plan, or if the vote fails, even if they hold it and it fails, she says she will never back the reconciliation bill. Never, she says. It's a great eye roll you got going there. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about her. Politico reckon that, according to them, that some moderates have privately told them that to them, no infrastructure bill is better than an infrastructure bill that's paired with $3.5 trillion in spending. They're House Democrats, so they don't matter. Kirsten Sinema is the one who matters in the Senate. But she might not be the only one. Now, I think Manchin, he'll usually come along eventually. He likes to negotiate and haggle, but he eventually comes along. But Maggie Hassan is struggling for re-election in New Hampshire, and she's been very quiet over the last few weeks when asked about all this stuff. She said nothing about what she thinks of the bill. She said nothing about whether she thinks it should be put off. She's just not answering questions. So whenever I see that, I get a little bit nervous on behalf of the people who want some kind of vote from that person. Sorry. So that's the pressure from the moderates. On the progressive side, we've got this.
More than half our members will not move the bipartisan bill without the reconciliation bill being passed.
So we've got both sides facing the other one saying, I'm not going unless you go. And the date has to be, according to Kirsten Sinema, the 27th of September, which is Monday. And everyone agrees across the board, there will not be a bill ready for reconciliation by Monday. What do you think happens, Jen?
Oh, man. I mean, let's just point out on the first issue about drug prices, how this is widely acknowledged as a huge problem with very well publicized court cases about price gouging from the CEOs of some of these companies. I remember one happened a couple of years ago. The CEO that covered, I think it was EpiPens, and they had increased the price of EpiPens by 500%. And he was going to trial, I think, on securities fraud or something related. And they had to go through 200 jurors to find 12. 200 jurors, because everyone had already prejudged. Everyone was going to be impacted. Everyone knew someone who was going to be impacted by this guy, And I remember some poor reporter sat in on this selection process and tallied the reasons why people were being excluded as jurists. And one response was worth noting in its entirety. They said, "Do you think you can be impartial about this trial?" And I said, "The only thing I can be impartial about is which prison he goes to." And so I think, with the opioid crisis, you have that family that's also been under a tight scrutiny about the profits raised, billions of profits through these prescription drugs and the price of these drugs and the mechanism that they're prescribed. So I think there is a lot of public support for these bills, and that gets lost in the discussion, I think, about what Sinema is doing and what she's wearing while she's doing it. Is she curtsying as she thumbs down the $15 minimum wage, or what earrings she has on when she says she doesn't, she's changed her mind on the filibuster. And I think her seat is going to be one that's under discussion for the foreseeable future, given how much effort was put in by progressives to help win that seat, that she doesn't seem to be on board with any of the agenda items as we've seen.
I'll read you a poll along those lines, which I had ready right here, from just to prove what your point is. This is from Data for Progress. This is from July. Okay, so it's a fair way back, but I reckon her polling hasn't improved since then. Okay, among Arizona Democrats in July, Joe Biden had a 94% approval rating. Oh, for those days. Mark Kelly had an 85% approval rating. Sinema had a 54% approval rating amongst Democrats. Okay, you're not going to win primaries with that. Now you might say, oh, but she's going for independents. Arizona primaries have independents as well. So she's going for the independents, right? Yeah.
That's right. The state of Mavericks. That's right.
That's right. Exactly. Biden got 44% approval amongst independents. Kelly got 45% amongst independents. Sinema got 40% amongst independents. She was lower than Kelly and lower than Biden amongst independents. So she was going for them. She wasn't going for them very well. Wait for this. When Arizona Democratic primary voters were given the options, so that includes independents, okay, primary voters, were given the options of, I would vote to re-elect Kirsten Sinema, or I would vote for a different candidate who would get rid of the filibuster. Sinema won 22% of their support, and the unnamed filibuster person won 66% of their support. So I agree with you, Jen. I think her seat is going to be under scrutiny. I mean, unless she's a complete moron, she may be reevaluating her strategy. We'll see. But she's. I mean, I will give her credit for one thing. She hasn't said anything in public. All these comments which we've cited are leaks through Politico, which are obviously leaks from her and her group, but still they're not quotes. She hasn't gone public yet. She hasn't committed herself to anything, which is that's smart at least. So there is room for her to back down until she goes public. When she goes public, then there's no room to back down. So we'll see about that. I should say, by the way, it gets even more complicated because you might say there is a way around this, to unknot the Gordian knot. And that is if they get the bipartisan bill up without the House Democrats, with House Republicans. Because if they do that, then they don't need the reconciliation bill now. Kirsten Sinema will get her demand met. And then if they bring the reconciliation bill up afterwards, as long as the moderates don't screw the progressives, then there is a way forward there, right? So that is a way to untie the knot. If they can pass, if the left turn their backs on the bipartisan bill on the 27th of September, but the Republicans pass it. But it's not going to happen because there are only 2 members of the House Republican Caucus who said anything positive about this bill, and they are Kinzinger and Fitzpatrick. Kinzinger might as well not be a Republican these days.
I mean, he's already been excommunicated,
Yeah,
right?
Crazy brave, that guy. And also Steve Scalise is whipping against the bill. So they're not going to get so many people. They can spurn 50 progressives. And there are 96 people in the Progressive Caucus that Jayapal says the majority of which will not vote for this bill, the bipartisan bill, unless the reconciliation bill's there as well. So someone's got to back down. And also Pelosi wants to make it harder for some reason. So she's saying she's not even going to put the reconciliation bill for a vote until she gets a guarantee from the Senate that they'll pass the reconciliation bill, which she ain't getting by Monday. I'll tell you that right now. So
TikTok.
yeah, that's right. So it's a bit of a mess. That is a classic little standoff. The other one is, anything else to say about that particular standoff? Like, do you think, let me ask you, if this all collapses in a heap and they get nothing, is Biden done? Is that the end?
I don't think so, because there have already been sort of deliverables, right, in terms of the vaccine rollout for the people who want them, the child tax credits. And I think the important thing about that program is that it's cash, right? Normally the United States does work through the tax code. So you get it at the end and it's just a number on a spreadsheet. It's not actual, tangible money in your account. This one is, which is why it's contributing so dramatically to the reduction of childhood poverty, right? And I think the 2022 midterms are going to determine, right? So, and that matters how the prosecution is going for the insurrection, who is allowed to stand, is Trump still in the mix for 2024? Is he still one of those central figures that's able to garner support? And who's on the ballot for 2022? We're already seeing congressional ads. I just saw my very first one last week against Madison Crawthorne in my home state of North Carolina. And some of these ads, I think everyone should keep their eyes peeled because these are coming. It's really incredible. So in 2018, for the last midterm session that we had, it was all about healthcare, right? Some of the subject of some of these bills, healthcare, infrastructure. Now the Republican side really just features a lot of weaponry. They're blowing stuff up. They're handling larger and larger weapons. That it's a real big symbol within their campaign strategy.
What weapon was Madison Cawthorn wielding?
A pistol in one clip. This isn't his ad. This is actually an opponent's ad, but this is how he is regularly photographed. Beating up a tree, with his bare knuckles.
Sure.
And so I think that election season is already upon us. So I think the conclusion of some of these policy bills is actually potentially going to have to wait until the midterms.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the reason I said that, by the way, I was a bit brusque with my "is this the end?" But just to spell out just slightly why I'm actually not convinced. I don't know, but I'm in two minds. The reason why I think it might be potentially is just because if he's obviously in a delicate point at this point in time, Biden, with his polling, and he's polling 31% in Iowa at the moment. Not that matters; it's a red state, but still. If the Democrats go into a spiral of blaming each other and just falling to bits amongst it, if they become divided, then, he's already up against it in the midterms. If he gets smashed in the midterms, which he will unless the Democrats unite, and not just unite, but come out hard, like much harder than you would expect normally in the midterms. They've got to be motivated to vote. Unless the Democrats do that, then he is facing, I think, some pretty strong headwinds in 2023 and 2024, shall we say. Yeah.
Well, and of course it matters what happens, in the preceding months up to the election, right? Some of the polling numbers that you've quoted are around Afghanistan. And we know that foreign policy is not a driver of how people vote in the United States. And those stories are already being superseded by the next crisis. So it's not going to be a contentious issue for 2024. I've had people ask me this. We have 30 years of polling data about how Americans do not vote on foreign policy in their domestic calculations.
I would play devil's advocate in one respect, though. I agree with you completely that foreign policy is not a voting issue. But I think that we political nerds, if I can include you in that group, I think we approach politics in a more rational way than a lot of other people do.
Of course we do.
Who aren't obsessed with politics. And so we talk about issues. We talk about policies. We talk about concrete things. We don't talk about abstract emotions or vibes. But I feel like with Afghanistan, I think the reason his numbers went down so rapidly was not because all of a sudden everyone in America was furious about Afghanistan. I think most people in America were happy to see America go from Afghanistan and just think, oh, the whole place is a fucking mess. I think that is the way I think a lot of people would think. But I think the reason his poll numbers are driven down so fast was because he received unanimous criticism, just across the board, just everyone, the entire media, conservative media, liberal media, everyone was attacking him for different reasons, from different sides. There were refugee people attacking him. There were the militant people attacking him. There were Islamophobes attacking him. There were just people attacking from all angles. It was just a general vibe of everyone hates Biden. And I think people absorb that. And I think that a number of people just got the feeling that Biden's kind of shit because everyone was knocking him all the time. And so I think that's the issue. It's not a case of a particular issue or whether Afghanistan reverberates. It's, does Biden get into a funk where he becomes a loser who everyone hates? Does he get into the Jimmy Carter zone? Right? Jimmy Carter didn't do anything particularly wrong. He just got into this zone where everyone's going, well, he's done. Forget him.
That's right. Well, he wore a sweater and told everyone to turn down their thermostat a little bit and carry his own bags to the helicopter. So that wasn't enough, gravitas for the public.
I'm saying these are stupid things, but I just feel like the question is, does Biden get into a position where he's in he's done zone? And if he is, there's no reason for him to be done. He's just done unless something amazing happens. So that is the reason I was saying it's possible. If he gets on a real losing roll, he can't come back from it. Possible. I haven't actually made my mind. But anyway, should we move on to the shutdown? Because that's the last thing.
Let's do
that because this is obviously the thing which I am most sorry that we are potentially.
We'll talk about the shutdown and then we'll shut down.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So there's two issues here. One is the government shuts down at the end of the month. Okay, so Democrats want to pass an extender until December 3. The second thing is America hits a debt ceiling in 2 to 3 weeks. So the Democrats want to extend until December next year, 2022. I think that's dumb for reasons I'll get to in a second. But anyway, Mitch McConnell has flat out said Republicans are not going to support a debt ceiling increase. Let me read you his quote. I read this on the show, but it's just so shameless. Let me make it perfectly clear. The country must never default. The debt ceiling will need to be raised. But who does that depends on who the American people elect. I have voted a number of times to raise the debt ceiling and divide government. I voted to raise the debt ceiling to cover all of the spending through the present as part of a bipartisan negotiated caps deal between the previous administration, the Speaker, and myself. So the only issue is, whose responsibility is it to do it? A Democratic president, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate. We have opposed virtually everything they've done this year. They've done it through 2 reconciliation bills, a rescue bill, and now they're trying to do it again. It's their obligation. They should step up. It's hard being the majority. They're the ones who will raise debt limit. So in other words, he's saying it absolutely has to happen. but no, I'm not
But
doing
we're
it.
not going to help. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to help. Like, it's just, what? That's the kind of logic you only hear from someone who is entirely unaccountable. If there was any accountability at all, you go, you can't say that. But no one cares. They even blink.
Yeah.
That's his logic.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, he's right that Democrats don't even need him. They can pass and extend it through another reconciliation bill. Like, I know you're worried. People are worried. Oh, hang on. That's my editor calling for me to come down right now.
The lights are on.
Well, as it turns out, my editor was really shitty with me. So I was going to play the phone call, but no. So I cut there. I have now space jumped into the future. If you're wondering, if you're watching the podcast or listening to it, and you're wondering what this welcoming, warm, inviting environment in which I'm sitting, actually, it looks like an aftershot from I Am Legend when everyone has deserted the surrounds. It's like a wasteland, and it was like an empty office that people moved out from. This is the ABC in the COVID zone at nighttime. There's no one here. I'm actually sitting at my desk, but let me just continue on with what I was saying. I will stitch this all together at the end. It'll make sense. It'll be a bit like a Christopher Nolan movie, but we'll get there. I was saying that the Dems don't actually need Mitch McConnell to raise the debt ceiling, because there's actually a provision in the regulations for reconciliation that specifically say you can use reconciliation for debt ceiling legislation. So they can do it with 50 votes in the Senate, not a problem. And they have the 50 votes. For some reason, the Dems don't want to do that. I don't really understand. They're saying that you can only increase the level of the debt ceiling with reconciliation, whereas they want to actually just put it off, like suspend the debt ceiling for like a year or two, like they've done a few times recently. I must admit, I don't understand that logic. If it was me, I just extend the debt ceiling to be $1 zillion, a quintillion dollars. It's such a stupid device. It achieves nothing, because you've already spent the money. Now you're just paying for it. Why you'd stop yourself from paying the debts that you've incurred, I have no idea. It really achieves nothing but creating hostage situations where people can refuse to extend a debt ceiling unless they get something they want. In fact, Mitch McConnell famously said in 2011 that the debt limit was, quote, a hostage that's worth ransoming. So if they do put it off for a year, say, which is what they want to do, they want to put it off to December 2022, just after the election. If Mitch McConnell is the Senate leader at that point in time, then he is just going to set up a hostage situation. He'll say, I won't extend the debt ceiling unless you give me X, unless you pass a tax cut or whatever, or cut spending or something like that. And it will ruin Joe Biden's presidency if he doesn't get it. So why give him that opportunity? Just extend it for the next 7 million years. I don't know. Because this is a serious hostage, by the way. The Moody's they found that a debt ceiling breach would cost up to 6 million jobs, wipe out as much as $15 trillion in household wealth, and hike the unemployment rate to about 9%. It'd be like another GFC. So I don't understand why Democrats want to give Mitch McConnell that opportunity, but anyway, and especially given that no one would care if you got rid of it. It's such an abstract concept. I have to explain it every time I mention it, because people were going, what? Sorry, debt ceiling? Huh? Why do they have that? It doesn't make any sense. I don't think anyone would care if they got rid of it. But Democrat moderates seem keen to not own this move by themselves. I can understand that. They think it might make them look bad. I don't think it would, but that's what they think. So that's essentially what I think both sides are playing for. The Democrats are trying to stop the moderates having their fingerprints all over it by themselves, and the Republicans want to create exactly that situation for the 2022 election. Anyway, so the House voted to keep the government funded, suspend the debt ceiling, so the federal debt limit, and to provide disaster and disaster relief from one of the hurricanes recently, and refugee aid for the Afghan refugees, which are all popular bills, all in the same time, in the same bill. They thought, we'll package all these things that you want to the Republicans, and there's no way you'll say no. You certainly won't filibuster it, surely. Yeah, they'll filibuster it. They'll definitely filibuster it because they are unaccountable. I don't just mean Republicans here. I mean, the whole of Congress is largely unaccountable. No one understands what goes on there. You can get away with any kind of bad behavior. So they'll filibuster it. But and you can kind of see why Republicans are playing hardball on this. Yeah, like there was a Politico Morning Consult poll just the other day where they asked which party people would blame more if the US was to default on its debt because it breached the debt ceiling and they didn't pay off the debt they owed. 33% said Democrats, 42% said both parties, and 16% said Republicans. So of course the Republicans would roll the dice. Yeah, even when the Republicans have been blamed, and sometimes in the past with government shutdowns and debt ceiling standoffs, the Republicans have been blamed badly in the polling. It never lasts. When it comes to the election, people forget, people don't care, people worry about other stuff. Let me go through them. 995, 96, there was a shutdown, government shutdown. Republicans just got pantsed in the polls. But then in the 996 election, the Democrats gained only 2 seats in the House and they lost 2 seats in the Senate. And in 2011, there was a debt ceiling stoush. The Republicans kept a 33-seat majority in the House in the 2012 election, although Obama was re-elected. I think he would have been re-elected anyway. After the 2013 debt ceiling fight, Republicans in the 2014 elections, they had double-digit gains in the House and they won the Senate back. So they were rewarded. Then there was a 2019 government shutdown, very temporarily. And the Republicans in 2020, which we all remember, had a net gain of, 10 seats, 12 seats in the House. They nearly won the House back from the Democrats, and they lost the Senate, but that was because Georgia was a very special case with those weird two seats going up right around the insurrection period. That was all like Trump was going to be crazy, if you recall. They're saying the election was stolen and stuff, and the Republicans had a genuinely good Senate election even after that shutdown issue. So they haven't really been punished that much. So why wouldn't they push back? They're completely unaccountable, like I said. So anyway, that's the situation. I'm now going to jump back to Dr. Jen Hunt to where I just gave her a chance to say something briefly about all this shutdown stuff before we then zoom off to our interview with Dr. Nick Bryant. I know this is quite confusing. Just tell me your thoughts on the shutdown.
Well, shutdowns have become sort of routine. I don't think anyone is, they're not the anomalies they used to be, but it would be the first shutdown under a Democratic Congress. Most of the shutdowns that we've seen have been under Republican control. When Ted Cruz was reading Green Eggs and Ham to shut down the government over the first healthcare bill. So I think this is a test of Democratic governance to get these key policy issues through, even if the Republicans aren't going to do their part.
Okay. I'm afraid I have to leave it there. Well, I'm now going to cut to the interview with Nick Bryant. Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate it. I'll come back and say bye to you guys after this interview. Dr. Jen Hunt, as always, where can they find you?
I can be found on the Twitters at Dr._Jen Hunt. Please leave all your compliments there and send all your complaints to Chaz. Thank you.
I will, don't worry. And thank you so much. I'll see you later, Dr. Jen. Now for the Nick Bryant interview. And we're now joined by the one and only Nick Bryant, just emerged from quarantine, I believe. Nick, is that true?
Chaz, I did manage to stage an escape from quarantine after 14 days. And I mean, I lost count of the number of PCR tests that we had. But a triumvirate of the Australian Defence Forces, the New South Wales Police, and a doctor dressed in full PPE gave us these certificates which said we could leave. And in classic Australian fashion, they said you can leave, but we're going to keep you another 24 hours. And it was then that the words of Clive James came to mind. You know, you've got to remember that Australia wasn't descended from convicts, it was descended from prison guards. And even though we weren't given any more kind of medical checks thereafter. We still had to stay another night in quarantine, but yeah, we're finally out, and it's nice to be semi-free.
Yeah, we do love our bureaucracy in Australia. Now, the last time we spoke to you about your book, When America Stopped Being Great. And we spoke to you at length. I think it was about a 20-minute interview where you were telling us about all the stuff that led up to Trump. And we were talking about it as if history ended at that point in time when your book came out. But of course, history didn't end at that point in time. It kept on going. It kept on going with the insurrection. It kept on going after that with the election steal. It kept on with attempted election steal. It kept on going with everything that's happened this year. It's just spinning out of control. So first of all, can you remind us of the trends that you observed going into 2021, and then tell us, have those trends continued?
Well, look, what I argued in When America Stopped Being Great was that Trump was not an accident of history. Indeed, he was almost historically inevitable. And, the events of 2020 just proved that thesis. I mean, the book came out in Australia before that. We have updated it. The new edition is available in Australia now. And really, the election of 2020 and what happened afterwards reinforced the thesis. I mean, here was a guy that got, 74 million votes?
Yep.
That's how many Americans clicked on the terms and conditions of his presidency. He won 25 states. Had it been for 50,000 votes shifting in a handful of states, he could easily have been a second-term president. It was that close. It came close, fairly close to being thrown into the House of Representatives, as you know, in a tie in the Electoral College. And then, of course, what we saw thereafter was also sort of unsurprising, shocking but unsurprising. That day when, that day that'll live in infamy, really, January the 6th, when we saw the storming of the Capitol, when we saw the attempt to overthrow the results of what were, despite its closeness, a very clear-cut election. And then, of course, after that insurrection had happened, we saw almost half the Republican Party return to the chambers that night to vote to overturn the election. And any hopes that that was going to be a moment of repudiation for Donald Trump, proved otherwise. I mean, it was another moment of radicalization for the Republican Party. So the book is about how a broken economy led to a broken politics, how a Republican Party has become increasingly radicalized over the years, how technology and culture and sociology and politics and race all contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. And as we have seen in COVID and as we have seen on January the 6th, those trends have continued, and America is even more polarized now than it was, when I first wrote the book about a year ago.
I look at some of the new breed coming through at the moment. Trump may well be back. We still don't know at this point in time. But leaving him aside for a second, I look at, say, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who wears a mask when she's not on camera. I saw her on social media this week, but as soon as she's on camera, she takes the mask off. Madison Cawthorn, who chose exclusively to fill his staff with communications people rather than policy people, because he thought that's what a congressperson does these days. Lauren Boebert, whose reaction to what went on in Afghanistan was legendary. I don't think I've played you guys this. Hang on, I've got the clip right here.
The blame starts at the top with Biden and his hand-picked vice president, who bragged that she was right there making the same bad decisions. And if not for her own dereliction of duty, she should be impeached for not demanding we invoke the 25th Amendment. It is time for action. Impeach Biden, impeach Kamala Harris, and throw in the Secretary of State if you could get him back from vacation.
For me, that sums up this era. We've got someone who's good-looking, fluent, and inexplicably angry, saying that Kamala Harris should be impeached for not supporting the 25th Amendment. That's where we're at. What are your thoughts on them?
I fear that is where we're at right now. We have lost the moderate middle in American politics. All of those kind of moderate Republicans who were willing to compromise with the Democrats at certain moments have generally been primaried out of existence. As you know, if you compromise on Capitol Hill, you generally get hit by a primary challenge. So a lot of the sensible right has gone. And in their place, we have ended up with people like that, and politics has got even more crazed. And after January the 6th, I went down to Florida. I went to the CPAC conference there, where Donald Trump made his kind of comeback speech, and it was like a revival meeting. I mean, they even had a golden statue. You remember that golden icon of Donald Trump, and the cult-like devotion to Donald Trump was just frightening. And the refusal to accept the reality of the election result, which, as I said, was close but clear-cut, was frightening. And American politics just seems to be hurtling right out of control right now. And we have this situation where you just have this shared continent occupied by warring tribes. And there is this thought, well, Biden has lowered the temperature and all this kind of stuff. Well, just wait for the midterm elections next year. Wait for the presidential election in 2024. I don't think we're going to see a lowering of the temperature then. I think we're going to see it at a fever pitch, and that's really worrying.
A couple of things to add from me. Firstly, you talked about the people being primaried. It's not just primaried, but also just resigning. Like this week, I don't know if you saw, Anthony Gonzalez retired. He's 36 years old. He's a Latino Republican who was an ex-footballer. He's exactly the kind of person you think is the future of the party. And he resigned. He was one of the 10 Republican Congress people who voted against Trump, to be impeached. And he was probably going to get primaried, but that's not why he resigned. He resigned because his life had become a misery. He talked in detail about his toxic existence, how he needs security to look after him, and how his children, his young children, are scared of their life. And that is kind of, it's not just him, we're seeing this everywhere, that people who occupy volunteer positions as election workers are being threatened. And it's just raising the stakes in a slightly scary way from my point of view.
Yeah, it really is. And it raises the specter of political violence. It underscores the notion that January the 6th really wasn't an aberration. We could see repeats of that. Again, when the results of the midterms come in, or the results of the next presidential election. I mean, the refusal to accept presidential results, the delegitimization of presidents, has been a feature of American politics, a growing feature for more than 20 years now, going back to Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. People refused to accept the legitimacy of Barack Obama based on racist grounds, that he wasn't an American, specious racist grounds, of course. And now you've got this with Biden, and it's just spiraling out of control. It's a great point about the resignation, not just of moderates anymore, is it? And not just of compromisers. It's the resignation of people who, 10 years ago, we'd have thought were on the right of the party. And the primary campaigns launched against people who we would have regarded as staunch conservatives. I mean, one of the sort of clues that a lot of people missed ahead of the rise of Trump was the demise of Eric Cantor. You remember him, right on the right wing of the party, one of those congressmen that got together the night that Obama was inaugurated and basically said, we are going to destroy his presidency. We are going to become the party of no. We are going to limit this guy to a one-term presidency. He was staunchly conservative and staunchly obstructionist. And yet even Cantor was primaried because people thought he was too moderate. So, we really are in a worrying time for the American Republic. And Chaz, I just don't see how we get out of it. I don't see how these divisions are bridged. I don't see how the country comes together. I was stood on the inaugural platform when Joe Biden gave his inaugural address, and he really set out the mission of his presidency to heal this broken land. I just don't see how he does it.
No. How do you feel, if at all, because we've talked a lot about Republicans here, how do you feel at all that these trends have reflected themselves in the Democratic Party? Because it's not, this can't be just solely affecting one side of the divide.
Yeah, I mean, some people look at the next generation and see hope in younger politicians coming to the fore, but arguably, younger politicians on both sides are coming from the more sort of extreme wings of their party. And I think that is a problem right now. And there's a kind of paradox here as well, that as America has got more partisan, the parties themselves are finding it increasingly difficult to maintain discipline. I think you saw that early on in the Trump administration when they failed to overturn Obamacare. You know, the Republicans hated the Democrats, but at times, at crucial moments, they found it difficult to work together in the pursuit of legislative goals like overturning Obamacare. And you've got a similar situation now on the left in progressive politics where, you know, the Democrats themselves right now are struggling to come together to pass big bills on Capitol Hill. And, you know, part of that is a younger generation, a kind of absolutist young generation who just will not accept the idea of compromise. And arguably, you know, they're being asked to compromise too much. But you know, there is this absolutism now in American politics that's not just on the right, you know, it's on the left as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like the cult aspect of Trump is kind of unique to the right. Like, I don't feel there's any cult figures on the left. Like Bernie Sanders, they idolize Bernie Sanders, but if Bernie Sanders changed his mind about healthcare tomorrow, they would drop him like a hot rock. I feel like the extremism on the left is more about policy than about, like, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. It's not even policy really, it's tactics. One thing I just can't get past is when people say, oh, okay, we don't like the Supreme Court, let's stack it. Let's ruin the Supreme Court and just destroy it because we don't like their decisions. I mean, I think the Supreme Court needs reform. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think the reform should be to destroy it, which is what would happen if you stack the Supreme Court. So that to me is an example of the lack of compromise that you just described. But it's not so much a cult thing, so much as just a refusal to follow through on the middle ground. Like to just go, okay, if we don't get what we want. I mean, right now we're seeing it with Congress, with the reconciliation bill, that you would think if you have a 50-50 Senate and damn close to a 50-50 House, you would not expect to get a lot through. Usually in America, you would not get a lot through. But what we're seeing is people trying to get an entire agenda through as if they'd won sweeping victories. And, you know, they might succeed. But all I'm saying is that I think if I was in their position, I wouldn't expect to succeed. I'd hope to succeed, but I'd expect to get half a loaf. I don't think they're expecting to get half a loaf. I think if they get half a loaf, they'll be outraged. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think it makes it harder to see the brooking of that gulf that you described before. Like when you're saying you don't know how they get back together, that's my concern personally. But I don't live in America. Did you leave America because of this, by the way? Are you just discouraged?
I was discouraged. I mean, it certainly played into it. We didn't think that America was a particularly good place to raise the kids. You know, we've got a daughter who's actually born in America. I mean, she flies around the world now when we're allowed to fly with an eagle on a passport. The other kids have got kangaroos and emus. But yeah, this definitely played into it. You know, I was offered more time in America with the BBC, but I decided not to take it. And I mean, you know, you and I, Chaz, we love our America. We love our American politics. You know, it would have been unfathomable to me 20 years ago to consider voluntarily leaving the United States. And it would have been also unfathomable to think it wouldn't be a great place to raise the kids. But you know, a lot of factors played into that decision, but certainly a failure to recognize the country that I fell in love with as a kid was a crucial reason why we left, for sure.
What's your evaluation of Biden so far? You've talked about his inability to bridge the divide, but that's not necessarily on Biden. That just maybe no one can. What's your assessment of how Biden's gone so far?
Oh, look, I never really bought into the idea that Biden was the next FDR. You know, we've got this ludicrous analytical sort of bent towards always trying to identify a presidential soulmate of the present incumbent, haven't we? We always sort of try and say, you know, Obama's the next Kennedy and Biden's the next FDR. I always thought that was inflated. Part of that was based on what I saw early in the campaign. I was in Iowa, I was in New Hampshire. He came fourth in Iowa, he came fifth in New Hampshire for good reason. People there, as you know, take very seriously this responsibility of vetting the presidential candidates, and they took a close look at Biden. And I think a lot of people thought he was past it, and I did too, frankly. I thought he'd done his.
I still do.
Yeah. I really thought he'd done his dash as a politician, and if it hadn't been for South Carolina and Jim Clyburn, the Democratic African American congressman who gave him that crucial endorsement, probably the biggest endorsement in modern day American political history, I think he would have struggled. Look, I mean, having said that, I mean, COVID obviously came to his rescue. He could sort of bunker himself away in Delaware. Voters didn't see his frailties. Voters didn't see how he deteriorated, I think. And I think COVID also played to his strengths. You know, this idea of an empathetic leader at a time when the incumbent president was so unsympathetic towards so many people who were suffering in the country. So, you know, there was this sense, well, maybe Biden is the man for the moment. Maybe he is this kind of unifying figure. Maybe he is the man who can, you know, heal the country. But, you know, I think, you know, problem for Joe Biden is the challenge is just so immense. I mean, he always struck me as a bit of a space cowboy with his aviator shades. He likes driving a Stingray, doesn't he? Which was the car that the astronauts drove in the 1960s. But, and you thought this was kind of one last mission, but I just think it's mission impossible. And, you know, I think he did make a strong start in many ways, but, you know, he's run into the trouble that we thought he would run into trouble in a way, which is trying to unite a very fractious party at the moment and trying to bring together a country that is virtually impossible to bring together.
Do you think, as a member of the press, do you think that he has, even as president, been hidden from journalists? Like, because there's a lot of questions about the number of press conferences he holds, the number of questions he takes, the number of times he's off cuff. The fact he explicitly says in his press conferences, "I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to answer any more questions." He reads off a sheet who he's going to ask questions from. Like, do you feel that he has been unreasonably sheltered by his communication staff?
I do. Reading off the sheet, most modern day presidents do that. I mean, there is a kind of hierarchy, there is an order. Generally, you know, Obama, Trump, most of them were sent into those set-piece presidential press conferences with a list of reporters that they were going to call on. So that isn't unprecedented. But I do think that his communications team is pursuing a White House version of the Delaware basement bunker strategy. You know, try and hide him away. They're not hiding him away completely. Occasionally does speak to the press, but he's certainly not as available as Trump was. I mean, Trump, you know, there was a criticism of Trump that he didn't let his spokesperson hold briefings every day, but Trump did it himself, of course. You know, every time he walked to the helicopter, I mean, the number of times I thought the Marine One was going to run out of fuel while it was whirring away on the south lawn of the White House while Trump was sort of talking to the press, because sometimes these would go on for 45 minutes. And Trump would do that so regularly. I mean, Biden's not doing that. He's not doing the set-piece presidential press conferences. You know, he does send his spokeswoman out every single day. They rely much more heavily on that, of course, but that's not the same as putting a president in front of the press. And I think one of the reasons, obviously, is you know, I do think they are concerned about his energy levels. And, you know, as Australia found recently, when he seemed to struggle to remember Scott Morrison's name.
He definitely didn't remember.
You know, I mean, with Biden, there's always that kind of, I think, you know, the heart and the mouth moment for his press team. You know, what's going to come out of the mouth, and, you know, is he going to have a lapse like that again? Yeah,
I thought the moment that really stood out to me was like, at first I thought, oh, they're just keeping him away from the culture war. Like, they just want to keep the temperature down. I understood that, and I thought that was a sensible strategy. But now I think, no, they're just hiding him. And like the moment where it was really jumped out at me was actually just the other day when there was I'm sure you saw, there was a press conference with Boris Johnson and Biden. And I couldn't find video of it, unfortunately. I saw it live. Boris Johnson just started taking questions like he does. And they started asking Biden questions as well. And Biden clearly didn't want to answer them. And so Boris Johnson said, no, I'll take that. And he just started helping him out. Then eventually someone just explicitly said, Joe Biden, I have a question for you, and asked the question directly to Joe Biden. He started trying to answer, and his staff started yelling over the top of them. just screaming over the top, that's it, it's over, and like and shooing the journalists out of the room. So no one could hear the answer Joe Biden was trying to give. And then the press all went, like, to a person, they went into the pool, they went into Psaki's room to complain. And this is what Psaki had to say in response to that. Hang on, no, this is in her press conference a little later on.
The British Prime Minister in the American Oval Office called on British reporters, and then when American reporters tried to call on the American president, we were escorted out, let's put it that way.
Well, I think in that circumstance, and I think our relationship with the United Kingdom and with Prime Minister Johnson is so strong and abiding, we will be able to move forward beyond this. But he called on individuals from his press corps without alerting us to that intention in advance.
She suggested it was somehow unreasonable that they asked they asked Joe Biden questions without giving him advance notice that he'd be asked questions, which was, to me, an extremely strange response from Jen Psaki. Yeah, I'll let you find your... I'll keep on going for a sec while you're finding your reception there. I can see you wandering around trying to get a place with reception. That's cool. That's all right. It's a podcast. We can roll with it. Yeah, so anyway, so my take on all this kind of stuff before I ask you about the media. I'm going to ask you about how you think the media have been going, because we've kind of left them alone, and you are a journalist. I do feel that, to what we were saying before, just to add something, that at the moment everyone's kind of pissed off and raw, and people aren't showing each other grace. I feel like grace is missing in our society, not just America, mind you, but particularly not in America. People aren't giving each other any slack at all. As soon as they have the opportunity to hoe into each other, they do. And I worry because the real effects of the GFC, I don't think were felt for 3 or 4 years after the GFC. Like, I think America really went south more 2014-ish rather than 2010 or 2011. And I worry that we haven't seen the real effects of the pandemic yet. The pandemic has really rattled people, and I feel like we won't see the effects till maybe the next election or maybe just after it. And I worry the next presidential term, whoever's there, whether it's Trump or not, it's going to be an incredibly ugly term.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you about the GFC. It wasn't called the GFC in America, of course. It was called the Great Recession because it was so much more serious there than it was here. I totally agree about COVID. I think it's accelerated so many of the trends that we have seen in the American economy, especially over the past sort of 20 years since the turn of the century and really the advent of the internet. Who's prospered during COVID? Well, it's online traders. It's the financial people who can move money around. It's all those hedge fund managers. A lot of people that have skewed the American economy in a way that it just doesn't work anymore for so many average Americans. I mean, that has been the problem. I mean, you talk about that period after the GFC. Well, Chaz, I went there in 2013 after a 10-year break away from America. I've been in Australia. I went back. And the first thing that struck me about America was nobody seemed to believe anymore in the American dream. Nobody believed that their kids would lead more abundant lives than they did. People talked about economic security rather than economic aspirations and economic dreams. And that was so noticeable. And what I didn't connect it to at the time was the rise of Trump. I really didn't. But I think that kind of American dreaming is even less evident now than it was back then. And, COVID has caused huge problems for, small business owners, for, obviously it has exposed the huge racial disparities in income. And I don't think America is going to have a successful politics and a successful political middle until you have a successful American middle class. And the middle class is kind of a big chunk of people in America. It's a term that applies to a great many people. And unless they can fix the economy, I don't think they'll fix the politics.
Well, can I make you slightly more optimistic in one respect? And that is that if that is the case, that's about fixing the middle class, I can tell you that most economic indicators that I've seen suggest that median wages and middle income wages have been going up considerably for the last 5 years. There was this level of stasis for almost 30 years there, where it went from quite solid to gradually worse and worse and worse over time. But basically, since about 2015, they've gotten on their bike, and they're continuing to get on their bike. And so, it's possibly, if this trend continues for another 5 years, then maybe we might see the return of that middle class, and maybe they might chill out a bit. I don't know. I'm just trying to be optimistic here.
No, that's really interesting, because I don't think that is necessarily the perception of the people who are necessarily the beneficiaries of that. No. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the Great Recession was it ended. I can't remember the precise month, but when you asked most Americans when it ended, they thought it was about 2.5 years later. So those kind of economic sort of realities don't always create a kind of new mental reality. And I think there is still this sort of big perception in America that the economy is benefiting people like Jeff Bezos. It's not benefiting people like me anymore. And I do think that has been one of the key reasons. I mean, the great paradox, of course, was that the beneficiary of it politically was a billionaire who managed to portray himself as a working class hero. But yeah, I do think, I mean, I'm less pessimistic about the economy than you are, because, you look at AI and you worry that AI could do to the white collar sector what automation did to the blue collar sector. And you could not just have the sort of Rust Belt rage and the Coal Belt rage that, was such a sort of key factor in the rise of Trump. You could have a kind of white collar rage as well. And, I think that's a concern over the next sort of 5 to 10 to 20 years.
Jeez, I hadn't have thought about that. Okay, we've got you for about 2 more minutes. So let me just ask you, well, actually, just very, very briefly, you got COVID in the middle of the New York COVID epidemic, didn't you? And you got pretty bad, didn't you? So can you tell us briefly what that was like?
Yeah, it was horrible. And my wife got it even worse. And it was really worrying for her and us, because she was heavily pregnant at the time. And that was an extraordinarily worrying time. I think, a doctor that we knew said, go to hospital. But this was a time, Chaz, when literally ambulance drivers in New York City were saying, don't get in my ambulance if there's any way you can avoid it. So we did give Fleur a couple more hours. She did start breathing a bit better. She was really struggling to end her sentences. It was really worrying. But then came the birth, which was quite extraordinary, because Fleur went into labor as the George Floyd protests were literally unfolding outside of our windows. We lived close to Brooklyn Bridge and Manhattan Bridge, and this was a focal point for the protests. And as Fleur went into labor, and we'd gone for a home birth because there were so many restrictions in hospitals because of COVID for partners, I would have had to leave after about an hour. So we went for the home birth, and then our home was literally besieged by protesters and NYPD helicopters. Literally, they were flying over our apartment building as Fleur went into labor. And there was this kind of worrying moment where you thought, well, if something did go wrong, our emergency routes to the hospital would be, compromised, maybe cut off. Our midwife's assistant was stopped by the NYPD on the way into our apartment building because she was breaking curfew. There was a curfew at the time. So it was just an extraordinary time to be in America. We not only had COVID, but then, a few months later, Fleur, my wife, gave birth to our American daughter in the midst of those protests, amidst of an unbelievably epic history that was sort of swirling outside of our windows.
Well, I can now see why you came back to Australia. You've got to go. So Nick Bryant's updated book, it seems, is When America Stopped Being Great. Nick, thanks so much for speaking to us. We've got to do this another time because there's so much more to talk to you about.
And Chaz, next time I see you in that Oval Office set, I'm going to hand you a copy of the book, because one thing that we found out recently was Joe Biden is reading it, the updated edition that's available now in Australia. When America Stopped Being Great has made it into the Oval Office for real. So I'm determined that it should be in your Oval Office too. So next time I see you, I'll give you a copy.
Our Oval Office is accurate in every other way. So let's fix that up. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Take care, mate. All the best.
And that was Nick Bryant. I'd love to call him Dr. Nick, but as is the theme of this podcast, everyone's a doctor, but sounds a bit Simpsons, so I won't do that. I was going to bring up, I honestly ran out of time so badly with Nick then. I wanted to bring up Afghanistan because I wanted to hear what he had to say about it, and also I want to give you some updates. But next time for Nick in Afghanistan. I'll give you guys some quick updates and then we'll wrap up. There's confirmation this week that they hit the wrong guy with the drone strike. I'm not surprised about that. The Indian, I've mentioned this on the show, but I think you guys should know as well. The Indian media have reported that the ISIS terrorist, who actually was the original suicide bomber who murdered 13 US troops and like 169 Afghan nationals, he was actually freed from Bagram after the American troops. Remember, they left Bagram on August 15 in the dead of night, and they disabled things and they just switched off the lights and didn't tell anyone, just left, and then got stripped for parts, and people just let the prisoners go. He was one of those prisoners. So the Americans, I would say, negligence in the way they departed from at least Bagram came back to haunt them. That's a bit depressing. Another update here. Khalilzad, Zalmay Khalilzad, he brokers a lot of deals between Taliban and America. He was negotiating with Taliban just recently for America. He's confirmed the Taliban were happy for America to secure Kabul. After when they came into Kabul, the Taliban, it turned out, like I told you this story a few weeks back. He's confirmed it. Well, at least he says he's confirming it, that the Taliban were very happy for America to hold Kabul and to keep the security going. And so that to me is amazing that America chose not to do that because they didn't want to use the troops. They only needed the troops for a couple of months at most, and they could have gotten everyone out. There would have been, they could have made sure there weren't suicide bombers everywhere. They could have done what they needed, and it would have been the safest situation for them. They wouldn't have been fighting the Taliban. Taliban were happy for them to do that, and they could have got all their people out. All the people would help them, all the Americans, all the green card holders, but they chose not to. So a lot of consequences flow from that. How many people were left behind? Well, I mentioned on the show as well, Mayorkas in a roundabout way said that about 2,000 special immigration visa holders got out of Afghanistan, it turns out. So there's probably about 20,000, if not much more than 20,000 still there. That goes with the several thousand green card holders that are still there and the 100 or so American citizens. And just remind you, even now, after all this clusterfuckery, in an NPR poll the other day, 74% of Americans supported admitting Afghans who worked with the US government into America. 73% supported admitting Afghans who had served in the Afghan Special Forces. 65% supported admitting Afghans who feared oppression from the Taliban, just general refugees. 65% supported that. You could have got as many as you wanted if they just held Kabul for a month, just kept, I don't know how many troops they would have needed. It doesn't matter. You would have got them out then after you got everyone else out. No. Anyway, I can understand why Biden was suspicious of the military, but I'm not sure the consequences were great. And now we've got a situation where Ned Price, he's a State Department lackey, is saying these kinds of things when asked about his attempts to get more American citizens and green card holders and special immigration visa holders out of the country at the airport. This is what he said.
We have been very clear that the individuals who have expressed a desire and a willingness to leave via Mazar-e-Sharif should be allowed to leave the country. The fact that, to my knowledge, a charter flight has not departed Mazar has nothing to do with anything that the State Department has or has not done, and in fact, quite the contrary. The State Department, as we have said, has pulled every lever available to us. We have gone to extraordinary lengths with not only our engagement with the Taliban, but also with these other constellation of groups on the ground and operating from afar, and also with countries in the region. And to our minds, these flights, these individuals, there is no reason they should not be able to depart, and that's what we're continue to focus on.
Can I circle back to something my colleague said when she was asking about women's rights and Taliban alleged abuses? You said the U.S. will hold them accountable. How are you going to do that? If you can't even, if you said you've used every lever you've had, and you can't address this issue.
I've said we've used every lever we've had in the narrow and specific issue of charter flights leaving from the Mazar-e-Sharif airport in northern Afghanistan.
He essentially said we've done all we can do. Well, if they'd held Kabul a little bit longer, they could have done a lot more. And then the other thing I want to say is just to say that what's going on with the Taliban now is it's a bit ominous. There's a lot of talk about how they train women. This week they appeared to replace the Women's Affairs Ministry with a Ministry for Preaching and Guidance and the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. Bit of a mouthful. Wouldn't call that a catchy title, but essentially that's the stoning people ministry. That one. That's the hardcore ministry. So they're back and they're in the building that used to be the Ministry for Women. So how's that for symbolism? The interim Kabul mayor has apparently said that women must remain at home regardless of their employment status, pending a further decision. The Taliban are supposedly, I don't know what's a supposedly and reportedly, because all this stuff is very sketchy, will reportedly ban women's sports where their face and body are not covered, according to a Taliban spokesperson. And this includes cricket. He says women might face a situation where they could be exposed. Female students are allowed to go back into some universities, but they can only receive instruction from female or virtuous elderly male professors, which is a problem because only 14% of professors are women. So that could be a massive limitation. It's one of those ones where, yes, you're free to go to university if you meet these conditions that can't be met. They appointed their temporary cabinet a couple of weeks ago with 0 women, and that's the thing that got the UN Security Council's attention. Of course, they unanimously condemned the Taliban for a lack of gender diversity, but all this women stuff is very, very ominous. I'm not plastering over that. It's a problem, but to me, more of a concern is the fact they've got Sirajuddin Haqqani as their interior minister. This guy is on the FBI's most wanted list, and he has a $5 million bounty from the US State Department on his head. That's his wanted poster right there. That's his wanted poster. He might even have an American hostage. No one's quite sure. He took a bunch of hostages recently, and they think he might still have an American hostage. This guy, Mark Frericks, as a civilian contractor, was abducted in January 2020, hasn't been heard from since. We're not sure that he's got him as a hostage, but he might. Just the fact that the guy who's in charge of the security in Afghanistan is wanted by the FBI and the State Department and may have a hostage. Maybe. I think he's not a guy who should be in charge of security, but it gets worse. Oh, by the way, Blinken, when he was asked about Haqqani, he said, they've appointed some people with, quote, very challenging track records. Quite challenging. He's allied with Al-Qaeda, this guy. And he's in charge of security in Afghanistan at the moment. They actually have 4 of these Haqqanis, I believe, in the government. Let me read you a report about these guys. Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar had pushed for an inclusive cabinet that included non-Taliban leaders and ethnic minorities, which would be more acceptable to the rest of the world, apparently. At one point during the meeting, Khalil-ur-Rahman Haqqani, one of the Haqqanis, rose from his chair and began punching the Taliban leader. Bodyguards from both leaders then entered the fray and began firing at one another. Baradar escaped and is now in exile in Kandahar. The Haqqani network is now effectively in charge of the Afghanistan government, according to reports. Those reports, they do a lot of writing. I don't know if it's true or not. That's just what's in the reports. It's not. We don't have a lot of good intel at the moment into Afghanistan, but that's the intel we've got. That that the guy who a month ago people were talking about like he was the bad guy is now the comparative good guy, and he's in hiding after Haqqani tried to shoot him, the guy who might have a hostage and is in charge of security in Afghanistan. So things aren't going great. It's a little bit depressing. That's enough. I just want to get that in because we are not going to be doing a podcast for another 2 shows. Well, 2 weeks, 2 Fridays, and then we'll be back. So that's 3 weeks away. John's got some things to do. I've got some things to do. So we're just taking a little break and then we'll roll till kind of the end of the year. So I just wanted to just leave. I didn't want to leave anything hanging. So that's why I've gone a bit over time here. Thanks so much, guys, for listening and watching. I still, the people who are still listening and watching now a year after the election, I don't know what you're doing, but thank you. I will still read the comments. I hope you guys have a good 3 weeks until we are back. I might need that 3 weeks if the Dogs lose tomorrow. It might take me that long to recover. We'll see. So go Dogs in the grand final. Oh God, I don't think we're going to win. Fingers crossed. And I'll see you guys. I'll see you very important peppers in 3 weeks' time. See ya. Bye.